When Rachel walked into the dealership wearing sneakers and a simple hoodie, no one paid her much attention. The manager barely looked up before dismissing her altogether, assuming she didn't belong. But Rachel wasn't lost, and she certainly wasn't just browsing. She had come for a reason, one she didn't share with anyone. And when the truth finally surfaces, it won't just surprise the staff. It'll make them question how many times they've done this before. What happens when the person you overlook turns out to be the one in charge? Rachel Zegler stood quietly across the street from Hamilton Crest Auto Gallery, watching from behind a row of parked cars as customers stepped in and out of the gleaming glass entrance. The dealership had a certain energy about it. High-end vehicles on spinning platforms, banners promising exclusive offers, and employees whose suits seemed more expensive than the down payment on a sedan. But Rachel wasn't there to buy a car, at least not in the way people assumed. Dressed in jeans, a gray hoodie, and plain sneakers, she looked more like a college student with a curiosity about luxury vehicles than the secret new owner of the dealership. She took a breath, crossed the street, and pushed through the doors, stepping into the marble-floored showroom with an unreadable expression on her face. Inside, it smelled like polished leather and ambition. Salesmen in tailored blazers made their rounds with customers, their voices loud enough to be overheard, each pitch more rehearsed than the last. A receptionist with a tight bun gave Rachel a fleeting glance but didn't greet her. No one did. She moved toward a silver Mercedes coupe near the center of the floor, admiring its details not out of vanity but precision. Rachel had spent months reviewing this dealership's operations, secretly and thoroughly. She had read every sales report, reviewed employee performance files, and sat in on conference calls under a pseudonym. Her late father, a private businessman with a sharp eye for undervalued assets, had acquired majority ownership of the Hamilton Crest dealership just before his sudden passing. His wish had been clear. Rachel, his youngest daughter, was to oversee the transition and eventually lead the business. But she didn't want to walk in as a name on paper. She wanted to see the culture firsthand, how people treated those they thought had no power. And so, she walked in alone, unannounced and unrecognized. She hadn't been inside for more than 5 minutes when she heard the voice of a man approaching behind her. "Hey there," he said in a tone laced with forced cheerfulness. "Are you looking for the restroom, or just enjoying the AC?" Rachel turned and found herself face to face with Tony Briggs, the dealership's general manager. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, his navy suit immaculate, and the expression on his face said everything about how he had already judged her. She smiled and replied calmly, "Actually, I was hoping to ask a few questions about this car." Tony's smile faded into something flatter, less interested. "Look," he said, sighing, "these cars are in a very specific price bracket, all right? We get a lot of visitors who just want to browse, and that's fine, but we're focused on serious buyers today." Rachel raised an eyebrow but kept her cool. "And what does a serious buyer look like to you?" she asked. Tony chuckled. "Well, no offense, but usually they come dressed like they're not lost on their way to class." That got a few chuckles from nearby staff. One salesman even smirked openly, as if the whole situation was entertainment. Rachel didn't laugh. She looked around at the room full of people watching her, judging her, some pitying her, and others simply indifferent. But what struck her most was the ease with which Tony dismissed her, the way he didn't even pretend to offer help before deciding she wasn't worth his time. "That's a shame," she said, still staring at the car. "It's a beautiful model. I was hoping to take a look under the hood." Tony frowned now, his patience thinning. "Ma'am, I don't want to be rude, but unless you have an appointment or plan to make a purchase today, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the vehicle alone." He didn't say it loudly, but loud enough for others to hear, and now every eye in the showroom was subtly following the scene. Rachel hesitated. She could have revealed everything right then, told him who she was, pulled out her ownership documents from her bag, or even called one of the directors waiting on her confirmation email. But she didn't. She simply nodded and took a step back. Tony walked her to the door without another word. She heard one of the staff whisper something as she passed, something that sounded like waste of time, followed by another round of quiet laughter. Outside, The afternoon sun still burned bright, and Rachel paused before walking away. She glanced back through the showroom window where Tony was already shaking hands with a man in a suit, all smiles again. Rachel knew in that moment exactly what her next steps would be. She hadn't come to be acknowledged. She had come to observe. And now she had seen enough. Tony's name would soon be on her desk, but not in the way he expected. He didn't know it yet, but his days of gatekeeping were numbered. Tony Briggs always prided himself on having an instinct for people. He often told his staff that he could spot a real buyer from across the room. And for years, no one challenged him. His gut feelings had helped him rise through the ranks, from a pushy lot associate to the high-ranking general manager of Hamilton Crest. He was confident, polished, and intimidating in just the right doses to keep the team both productive and afraid. But in that confidence, there lived a blind spot, a deep-rooted belief that he could sum people up in a glance. It wasn't malice, not in the way he saw it. It was efficiency. He'd look at the clothes, the shoes, the car someone arrived in, and decide quickly who deserved his time. And when Rachel Zegler walked in that morning looking more like an undergrad than an executive, she'd been processed, filed, and discarded by Tony in the space of a breath. Now he barely remembered her face. To him, she had been another nameless visitor wasting oxygen in a space designed for real commerce. That same afternoon, after her quiet exit, Tony recounted the incident with amusement to a few team members during their coffee break in the upstairs lounge. "You should have seen the look on her face," he said, chuckling as he mimicked her posture and voice with mocking exaggeration. "I almost felt bad. But come on, hoodie, sneakers, no appointment? You think I have time to babysit every daydreamer who walks in here because they saw a TikTok about Lamborghinis?" The others laughed, some awkwardly, others too eagerly. But one of the newer interns, Marcus, didn't join in. He'd seen Rachel up close and caught a different kind of energy from her, a calm self-assurance that didn't match Tony's version of the story. He opened his mouth to say something, then stopped. It wasn't worth it. No one interrupted Tony during his speeches unless they wanted to be assigned the least desirable tasks for the next month. The next morning, Tony arrived early, scanning through numbers on his tablet while walking the perimeter of the floor. He was irritated. A delivery had been delayed, a client canceled an appointment, and upper management had scheduled an emergency board meeting without explanation. He muttered under his breath about incompetence and poor planning, unaware that the person behind the mysterious scheduling change was the same woman he'd ushered out the door 24 hours earlier. That thought didn't cross his mind when he saw Rachel again, this time standing outside by the service lot, speaking with one of the mechanics. She had returned, not in anger or triumph, but quietly, as if checking something. Tony's lips curled in irritation. "You again?" he called, walking over with the kind of forced patience he reserved for serial tire kickers. "Didn't we already have this conversation?" Rachel turned, smiling slightly, and said, "I just had a few follow-up questions." Tony crossed his arms and shook his head. "Listen, I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull, but I don't have time to play tour guide. If you want to test drive something, bring a financial statement and dress like someone who's serious." Her smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes shifted, cool and distant now. She didn't respond right away, letting the silence do the talking. Tony took it as a win and turned on his heel, muttering to himself about entitlement. Nearby employees heard it all, but no one intervened. It was easier that way. Tony had created an environment where questioning him meant isolation, and no one wanted to risk their job for a stranger. Rachel lingered for a while, taking mental notes. She watched how the receptionist greeted guests, how the sales team interacted with customers, and how junior staff avoided speaking up even when something was clearly wrong. The atmosphere was glossy on the outside but brittle underneath, held together by fear and routine. It was exactly what she needed to see. She left without another word, but not before snapping a few pictures from the lot, pretending to admire the cars. Tony saw it from his office window and shook his head. "Some people just don't get it," he muttered, returning to his spreadsheets. By the end of that week, Tony's tone had grown nastier. He told staff to stop entertaining freeloaders, and instituted a rule that no one could enter the luxury wing without first being screened. It wasn't a formal policy, but everyone understood what he meant. Appearances mattered. If someone didn't look the part, they weren't worth the time, and the team, conditioned to follow Tony's lead, complied silently. Rachel had become a running joke, referred to as the influencer or Miss Millionaire in disguise. They didn't know her name, but her face was passed around in whispers. What they didn't realize was that every laugh, every slight, every dismissive comment was being catalogued. Rachel wasn't watching as a victim. She was watching as an architect about to redesign the entire foundation. She was no longer unsure about whether the culture needed to change. Now, she was deciding who would survive the shift and who would be replaced. Long before Rachel Zegler ever walked through the doors of Hamilton Crest Auto Gallery, her life had been shaped by a father who believed deeply in quiet power. Elias Zegler wasn't a man who made noise, but he left an impact wherever he invested. A self-made entrepreneur who started from a single small repair shop in Queens, Elias built his empire with patience, vision, and a relentless eye for hidden potential. He believed in people more than numbers and bought businesses not because they were trending, but because they had soul buried beneath mismanagement, ego, or neglect. Rachel grew up in the shadow of that discipline, often sitting in the corner of boardrooms while her father negotiated takeovers with the calm of a chess master. While her older siblings chased headlines or fame, Rachel stayed close to the margins, watching and learning. Elias saw her as the one who understood the heart behind the balance sheet. Before his passing, when the doctors had given him months to live, he made one final acquisition, Hamilton Crest. To most people, it was just another premium dealership. But Elias saw something deeper, an operation with history, reputation, and a toxic culture in desperate need of a reset. In his final weeks, Elias called Rachel into his study and handed her the file. Inside were deeds, purchase agreements, background checks, and a single note in his handwriting that simply read, "It's yours. Fix it." Rachel didn't cry. She accepted the challenge as a quiet vow. She hadn't been raised to flinch from responsibility. Instead, she threw herself into research, reviewing the entire organizational structure, studying every member of the staff, and consulting with her father's trusted legal team to ensure a seamless transfer of ownership. But she didn't want to walk in on day one and declare herself the boss. That was never how Elias operated, and it wasn't how Rachel wanted to begin. She wanted to see it with her own eyes, feel the tension for herself, and decide from a place of truth. Her first 2 visits confirmed her suspicions. Hamilton Crest was beautiful on the surface but fractured at the core. Staff operated under fear. The general manager ruled like a gatekeeper. And the very people her father had hoped to uplift were being pushed out, turned away, or quietly ignored based on how they looked or dressed. Rachel remembered the quiet warnings in her father's voice, his caution about men like Tony Briggs, those who mistook control for leadership and ego for vision. Tony had been with the dealership for years before the buyout and was well liked by the former owners. He brought in strong numbers, kept turnover low, and made himself indispensable to the old guard. But Elias never cared about performance metrics alone. He cared about integrity. And Rachel now saw that Tony was the root of a culture that valued image over substance. She pulled up archived employee surveys, and though they were buried under layers of formality, the dissatisfaction was there. Complaints about favoritism, dismissive behavior, and a culture that didn't feel inclusive. No one had said his name out loud, but the signs were pointing straight at him. Back in her apartment, Rachel built a case. Not one of punishment, but of transformation. She created 3 folders: retain, review, and replace. Tony's name landed squarely in the last one. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for change. She knew that when she returned to the dealership again, it wouldn't be in a hoodie or jeans. It would be as herself. But before making any moves, she reached out to her father's old friend and legal advisor, Norman Bellamy. Norman had helped Elias structure dozens of acquisitions and had been waiting for Rachel's signal. When she told him what happened during her first 2 visits, Norman didn't sound surprised. "Your father expected resistance," he said calmly. He always said shaking a tree would rattle a few snakes. Rachel smiled. Well, one of them tried to kick me out the front door, she replied. Norman's tone hardened. Then let's make sure he walks out through the back. With Norman's help, Rachel scheduled a board meeting with the holding company that now owned Hamilton Crest. She didn't need their approval to take control, but she wanted their support. They agreed to meet on a Monday morning. Rachel spent the weekend finalizing her strategy. She drafted her introductory speech, prepared staff memos, and revised her restructuring plan down to the smallest detail. But even as she laid out the logic on paper, part of her felt the weight of what was coming. She wasn't just stepping into her father's footsteps. She was about to break apart the foundation of a legacy someone else had claimed as his own. She thought about the staff members who had laughed when Tony mocked her, and the interns who had looked away. She thought about Marcus, the intern who hadn't laughed, and made a mental note to find out more about him. The night before the reveal, Rachel sat in her father's old office chair at home, the one he had refused to replace even when the leather cracked. She closed her eyes and remembered his voice. Slow, careful, always calm. Anyone can build something flashy, he once said. But if you want it to last, build something honest. That's what she intended to do. But first, she would have to tear down the illusion. And by the time she was done, no one at Hamilton Crest would be able to say they didn't see it coming. The morning of the unveiling, Hamilton Crest Auto Gallery opened like any other day. Espresso machines hissed behind the lounge counter. Salesmen adjusted their ties in the tinted glass, and luxury vehicles gleamed under artificial light. Tony Briggs arrived at 9:07 a.m., 15 minutes before the morning huddle, gripping his usual double espresso and barking instructions about the delivery of 2 new Porsches. He was in a particularly brash mood, energized by a recent sale and oblivious to the storm circling above him. On his desk sat an email marked, "Urgent, board appearance," but he hadn't read past the subject line. He assumed it was another procedural visit, one of those corporate pop-ins from the holding group to review numbers and shake a few hands. Nothing to worry about. He had numbers, charm, and tenure on his side. He had no idea the woman he'd mocked, dismissed, and escorted out twice was about to walk through the same door again. Only this time, everything would change. At exactly 9:30 a.m., the glass doors swung open, but it wasn't just Rachel Zegler who entered. 2 men in tailored suits followed closely behind her, Norman Bellamy, her late father's legal executor, and Martin Chun, a senior partner representing the board's financial interests. Rachel wore a navy pantsuit and a crisp white blouse, her hair down and professionally styled. Her presence was quiet but commanding. The receptionist, who had ignored her days earlier, stood up abruptly, unsure whether to greet her or not. Rachel nodded politely and walked past her without hesitation. Eyes followed her like heat-seeking sensors. Conversations paused. Tony, who had just finished bragging to a client about landing another luxury fleet deal, turned his head and narrowed his eyes at the familiar face moving through his showroom with unexpected confidence. "No way," he muttered under his breath, setting his coffee down as he stepped forward to intercept. Rachel stopped a few feet away from him and extended her hand. "Tony Briggs?" she asked with a calm smile. "We met briefly last week." Tony's confusion morphed into irritation. "Yes, I remember," he said, forced grin in place. "Still shopping around?" Norman stepped in before Rachel could answer. "Mr. Briggs, we're here on behalf of the Hamilton Crest Holding Group. We have a meeting scheduled with you and the senior team." Tony blinked. "We do?" he asked, already reaching for his phone to check the unread email. "This wasn't on my calendar." Martin Chen's voice was even and precise. "It is now. Please gather your management staff and escort us to the executive conference room. We'll need the next hour uninterrupted." The authority in his tone wasn't up for debate. Tony's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course. Right this way." In the glass-walled conference room overlooking the showroom, 8 people gathered. Department heads, finance officers, and the assistant general manager filed in, unsure why their normal Tuesday had turned into an emergency executive meeting. Tony stood at the head of the table, still trying to assert control. Rachel sat beside Norman and Martin, her expression unreadable. When everyone had settled, Norman cleared his throat. "Let's begin," he said. "Effective immediately, there will be a leadership transition here at Hamilton Crest Auto Gallery. The majority stake in this dealership was acquired by the Zegler estate 6 months ago, prior to Mr. Elias Zegler's passing. Today, that transition is being finalized." He turned toward Rachel, who stood slowly, her palms resting on the edge of the polished table. "My name is Rachel Zegler," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "As of this morning, I am the new principal owner and executive director of this dealership." The silence that followed was thunderous. Tony blinked twice, then laughed, softly at first, then louder, as if the absurdity of the moment couldn't possibly be real. "You?" he said, leaning forward with disbelief. "This is some kind of joke, right?" Rachel didn't flinch. "No joke," Norman interjected. "All documents have been filed with the state and approved by the board. You are being informed out of courtesy." Tony looked around the room for support but found none. A few staff members avoided his eyes. Others stared openly at Rachel, now seeing her with new clarity. Tony's face reddened as he tried to regain composure. "You mean to tell me," he said, his voice rising slightly, "that this entire time you've been, what, auditing us? Spying?" Rachel didn't break eye contact. "Observing," she corrected. "I needed to understand the culture here before deciding how to move forward." Someone near the door coughed awkwardly, and Rachel took a slow breath before continuing. "There's a pattern in this building. One of exclusion, of assumption, of arrogance passed off as professionalism. It's not just bad for morale, it's bad for business. And it ends today." Tony stepped back from the table, arms crossed. "So what now?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. "You plan to fire me? Embarrass me in front of my team?" Rachel considered him for a moment. "That depends," she said. "We'll be reviewing every department, every role. Some people will be elevated, some reassigned. And yes, some positions will be vacated." Tony's mouth tightened, but he didn't respond. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, so suddenly, that all his old tools, his charm, his confidence, his dominance, were now useless. Rachel ended the meeting with a simple directive. All staff would receive a memo by end of day detailing the new leadership structure, cultural policy revisions, and an open forum for anonymous feedback. "We're not here to punish," she said, standing to leave. "We're here to rebuild. Together, if you choose to be part of that." As she exited the room, Tony remained frozen at the table, staring at the door like it had betrayed him. Down on the showroom floor, whispers swirled. Word spread fast. The woman they'd laughed at, ignored, and mocked was now in charge. Some employees felt a chill of dread. Others, like Marcus the intern, felt something else entirely, hope. In the days following Rachel's official takeover, the atmosphere inside Hamilton Crest shifted from stunned silence to tense recalibration. Staff treaded more carefully, conversations were hushed, and the usual performative smiles carried an edge of uncertainty. Rachel's presence on the floor was no longer ignored, but it was still unfamiliar. She didn't come in with an entourage or bark orders from behind a glass office. Instead, she spent hours shadowing departments, listening to customer interactions, and taking notes in a small black notebook that never left her side. Some employees were cautious, worried their past behavior had already sealed their fate. Others were hopeful, especially those who had once been sidelined or spoken over. A few, like Marcus, even approached her directly, offering insight or suggestions, which she accepted with gratitude. Tony, however, remained an enigma. He hadn't spoken a word to Rachel since the unveiling. He showed up every day, clocked in on time, and went through the motions, but the bravado was gone. Something behind his eyes had fractured. Rachel noticed it but didn't push. She wasn't interested in public humiliation or empty power plays. She wanted honesty. And honesty, she knew, sometimes came after the silence had been given enough room to breathe. That opportunity came one rainy Thursday morning when Rachel arrived earlier than usual and found Tony already seated alone in the executive lounge. staring at the wall across from him with a cold cup of coffee in hand. He didn't look up as she entered. Rachel paused, considered walking past, then sat in the chair across from him. Neither of them spoke at first. The rain tapped steadily against the windows, filling the space between them. Finally, Tony broke the silence. You ever work a job you hated, but stayed because you convinced yourself it was all you had left? Rachel didn't answer immediately. She waited. Tony looked over at her, eyes darker than she remembered, his voice quieter now. This place, it was never supposed to be my legacy. I just needed something stable after my brother died. I was 23, broke, and angry at the world. The owners back then liked me because I got results. Didn't matter how. Just mattered that the numbers went up. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. I learned early on that charm and control were the fastest way to rise. So I leaned into it, cut corners when I needed to, got rid of people who slowed us down, didn't ask questions. And somewhere along the way, I forgot how to see people. Everyone became a threat, a distraction, or a number, including you. Rachel listened without interrupting. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was something more valuable, awareness. Tony continued, his eyes distant. When you walked in, I saw someone who reminded me of my niece. She tried to get a job at a dealership once and got laughed out. Told her she didn't look the part. She stopped trying after that. Gave up. I told her to grow thicker skin. But now I see I was the one who needed it. His voice cracked, just barely. I kicked you out like you were nothing, and I've had to live with that playing over in my head every night since. Not because you're the owner, but because I wouldn't have treated you any better if you weren't. Rachel let the words sit between them for a moment before responding. You built something here, Tony, but you also built walls around it that kept a lot of good people out. I'm not here to erase what you did. I'm here to repair what's broken. Tony nodded slowly. So what now? He asked. You gonna fire me? Rachel shook her head. That's not my call to make today. I believe in giving people the chance to change, but change has to be chosen, not assigned. She stood, placed her notebook on the table and slid it toward him. There's a proposal inside. It outlines a restructuring plan and a new role, director of staff development. It's yours if you want it, but it's not a promotion. It's a clean slate. You'd be responsible for fixing the culture you helped create. Tony stared at the notebook, unmoving. And if I say no? He asked. Then I accept your resignation with respect, Rachel said softly. But if you say yes, we start over with honesty. She left him there with the rain still drumming against the windows. Later that afternoon, the notebook appeared on her desk with a single post-it attached. It read, I'm in. That evening, Rachel held her first staff-wide meeting. She addressed every department with clarity and transparency, laying out her vision, expectations, and plans for growth. She didn't speak like a CEO. She spoke like a builder. She introduced new mentorship programs, anonymous reporting channels, diversity initiatives, and performance reviews that included peer feedback. She also made it clear that titles no longer shielded anyone from accountability. Tony stood silently in the back of the room, watching her speak to the very people he once managed like chess pieces. Some of them looked at him with skepticism, others with silent curiosity. But for the first time in years, Tony didn't look away. As the staff applauded the closing of the meeting, Rachel stepped down from the small platform and joined them at eye level. She didn't linger, didn't pose for admiration, just moved through them, listening to voices she planned to amplify moving forward. That night, she walked through the now dimmed showroom, stopping by the same car she'd admired on her first visit, the silver coupe that Tony once blocked her from exploring. She rested her hand on the hood, not in victory, but reflection. The building hadn't changed, but the energy inside it had begun to, and as she turned off the final set of lights, she understood that rebuilding didn't start with firing people. It started with facing them. A month had passed since Rachel Zegler took official ownership of Hamilton Crest, and already, the dealership felt like a different world. The nervous silence that once blanketed the floor had been replaced with measured optimism. New policies had rolled out in phases, and while not everyone embraced them immediately, the shift in energy was undeniable. Morning meetings now included voices that had never spoken before, and employees once buried under bureaucracy found themselves leading initiatives. Marcus, the quiet intern who had witnessed Rachel's early dismissal, had been promoted to junior sales associate and was now mentoring a fresh wave of hires on how to approach customers with respect and patience. The dress code had been loosened to allow for personal expression, and Rachel's open-door office was frequented not only by department heads but also by janitorial staff, interns, and technicians who had never once stepped into the executive wing before. Trust was being rebuilt one honest conversation at a time. Rachel didn't pretend the transition was perfect. Some employees left, unwilling to adapt. Others resisted quietly, clinging to the old dynamics like life rafts in a rising tide. But she had anticipated that. What mattered to her were the moments of unexpected growth. The finance officer who apologized to her assistant for weeks of passive disrespect. The front desk receptionist who asked to take a course on conflict resolution. The technician who approached Rachel with a brilliant idea for restructuring the repair process. The changes weren't loud or flashy. They were subtle, sincere, and sustainable. For Rachel, that was the goal all along. She didn't want a revolution. She wanted renewal. And she could feel her father's presence in every quiet victory. Every person who now looked her in the eye not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Tony Briggs kept his new position, and while some staff were skeptical, Rachel's decision to give him a second chance began to show results. Tony didn't retreat into bitterness. Instead, he took his role seriously, attending leadership seminars, seeking mentorship outside the company, and opening up in ways his former self would have never allowed. At first, his efforts were met with suspicion. But as weeks passed and his actions aligned with his words, even the most doubtful team members began to soften. He scheduled weekly one-on-ones with every department head not to critique, but to ask how he could support them. He led workshops on unconscious bias and encouraged the team to call him out if he slipped into old habits. More than once, he did slip, but each time he acknowledged it publicly, an act that disarmed more tension than he realized. His redemption wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, uncomfortable, and earned. Late one evening, after another long day of restructuring meetings, Rachel found herself alone in the executive wing. Most of the staff had gone home, and the building hummed with a kind of quiet that only came after transformation had begun to take root. As she walked past her father's old corner office, a room that had remained locked since the day she took over, she paused. She hadn't entered it yet, not because of superstition or fear, but because she hadn't felt ready. That night, though, something pulled her in. She unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped into a time capsule. The desk was exactly as he'd left it. Papers neatly stacked, a fountain pen resting on a leather blotter, and a single photo of their family from a summer long past. The air still carried his scent. Old paper, cedarwood, and something else she couldn't quite name but immediately recognized. She walked slowly to the desk and sat in his chair, running her fingers along its worn arms. Everything was silent until she noticed a small, sealed envelope tucked beneath the desk calendar, her name written on it in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Her breath caught as she opened it, carefully unfolding the note inside. The words were few, but they struck deeper than any speech. If you're reading this, then you stepped into the fire instead of running from it. I didn't choose you because you're perfect. I chose you because you listen, because you wait, because you see. Led with those gifts. They're rarer than gold. Rachel sat still for a long time after reading it, letting the tears fall without shame. She wasn't crying from grief anymore. She was crying because, for the first time, she fully believed she was exactly where she was meant to be. As she left the office and turned off the lights, she didn't feel the weight of the building the way she had in those early days. She felt its possibility. Downstairs, the last cleaning crew waved to her as she passed. The showroom lights dimmed behind her, casting long reflections across the polished floors. Tomorrow, the work would continue. More conversations, more adjustments, more moments that would ask her to choose integrity over convenience. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. The girl who had once been laughed out of the showroom was now leading it into a new future. Not because of her name, not because of revenge, but because she earned her place through patience, purpose, and the courage to be underestimated.